Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new episode. Today we have with us Professor Hammer. He is Neil Gray Jr. Professor of English at Yale University. His research focuses on the history of poetry and its role in culture. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in poetry, its place in society, including how poetry has been defined in principle and in practice, and how the poet's life has been imagined and lived. So, I know a
Mhm.
lot of graduate students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research?
Mm. Uh, you can't write well about something you don't care about.
Very true.
That that's a good basic premise. So somehow, I would say somehow being open to recognizing what you care about is a kind of precondition. It's what makes it possible to start to invest in work that you're going to stick with and go somewhere with. Um, I think that one thing that comes to mind as you ask that question is sometimes there'll be a teacher, or in our conversation just before we got started, you were mentioning a colleague, a friend, another classmate who was talking about, uh, in this case, her enthusiasm for Kathy Acker. Well, it seems to me as though often a teacher or maybe a friend or a classmate, um, the enthusiasm that that person has for a subject will open it up to us and be infectious. Um, Conversely, sometimes sometimes we know that we're interested in something, and that leads us to that friend or that teacher who can then really take us somewhere. But so often there's something kind of interpersonal going on, I think, in what we select to study. I think, study in a profound way is always dialogical and a matter of conversation, including, of course, dialogue with what we're studying. I mean, with an author or perhaps a body of criticism or theory, some ways of thinking and talking about literature in this case. But also, in a kind of concrete, lived way, it's a matter of the people we connect with and kind of share our caring about with. Caring about, of course, doesn't have to mean loving something. Um,
Definitely.
Sometimes you want to write about something that makes you annoyed or or uh, or angry or just curious. Just something that you're ready to connect with. Um, that's all very general. It's not a very concrete plan or set of recommendations. Just some observations, really. In my own case, um, I went to graduate school expecting to study Renaissance English poetry. And that was my thing. I ended up writing a dissertation about postmodern poetry. How did that happen? I don't know exactly. Um, I have always encouraged my own students to kind of, be open to where their reading and thinking takes them. And I think while it's good to have a plan, it's also the case that we really have to kind of figure out where we're going. We probably don't know in advance. And if we do know in advance, maybe that's not much of a place to go.
Very true. So it's a kind of journey, an interpersonal journey. I
Yeah.
love that, definitely. So you've written and edited numerous books, literary biographies of
Mm.
poets,
Hmm.
including your 2015 book, James Merrill, Life and Art, the collected poems of May Swenson, Hart Crane, complete poetry and selected letters, just to name a few. So, can you tell us a little about how a poet's life might interact with their poetry? A very
Mm.
general, abstract question. But why is it important to be aware of the life of a poet, if at all? And
Hmm.
how has your research for these biographies influenced your readings of these poets' texts, if at all?
Yeah, well, those are a lot of questions, and we could talk about them for a long time. Let me say a couple general things. Um, well, I taught a seminar this morning for first and second year students, which is just an introduction to English poetry, English language poetry after 1800 or so. And and I told them, look, this is going to be a class in which we're going to ask the kind of question of what is a poem, and I'm going to try to lead you uh, through a kind of shorthand history of poetry across these centuries. Uh, but the question of what is a poem is deeply related to the question of what is a poet. And uh, the poet is a kind of role in culture, in society that uh, people embody differently, have different ideas about. Um, Historically, and often there'll be competing ideas of what a poet is at the same time. And the kind of field of literature is partly created, yeah, out of different styles, yes, but also different ways of uh, living poetry and being a poet. Um, Samuel Johnson more or less invents literary biography and literary criticism, and maybe to a certain extent textual scholarship, all at the same time in the 18th century when publishers ask him, commission him to write prefaces to these new editions of the complete works of Milton, Pope, uh, Cooley, all sorts of poets, including some we don't much read anymore. He writes what become his Lives of the Poets. These are prefaces to the work, to the texts that follow, to the poems that follow. Uh, we might view these two things, the story of the life. They're once biographies, and they're also have elements of criticism and of taste making. Judgments are being made at the same time. Uh, we might think of the work and the life being natural partners there, as they seem to be. Um,
Definitely.
and yet, on the other hand, you could also say they kind of they're not they all maybe belong in one book, but they're two different parts of it. And there's a way in which each of those editions of Johnson's emblematizes the way in which a writer or an artist's life is one thing, and that artist or writer's work is maybe another thing. So they're at once together, and there's a tension there too. They're not the same thing. They're connected, but they also pull in different directions. And the kind of history of criticism, particularly in the 20th century, has often kind of centered on kind of arguments about what the relationship between an author and a work is. Um, at any rate, this subject has always fascinated me. And I
Mm.
think it's, a part of what poetry is in English as well as in other languages and cultures. And it's deeply involved in how why we care about poetry, for example, and not only poetry, but I think poetry concentrates this question in a way that other literary forms don't quite. There are you can raise some of the same questions in with a fiction writer, for instance, or perhaps a playwright, um, and yet it's poetry that I think really foregrounds this kind of question of the relationship of a writer's life and work. Um, there's a quotation I like from Susan Sontag in her essay on Walter Benjamin. She says, "One cannot use the life to interpret the work, but one
Mm.
can use the work to interpret the life."
Oh, interesting.
It, that's a,
Indeed.
that's a kind of clever reversal. She's speaking partly to mid-20th century ideas embedded in the new criticism and other critical formations that really want to separate life and work. And she's kind of going along with it to a certain point, but then flipping it around and in a sense making the life all interesting all over again. I like it for a couple of reasons, besides being clever. Uh, and that is, it implies that it implies that lives are texts. There's something to interpret. Um, and if they're texts and if they require interpretation, that means, I think, two further things. One is that they're actually constructed, they are created, they're not given. And they are importantly given through texts. Oh, certainly a literary biographer's, but in general, a biographer's access to her subject is always, to some degree, if not totally, textual.
Mm.
We know people in biography through writing about them and by them. Uh, this is an important idea, and it's one that biographers often forget
Mm.
uh, because um, a biographer will sometimes quote something that a subject has to say, or in a letter, let's say, or perhaps a
Yeah.
diary, and and accept that as a kind of simple fact, something you can kind of pluck out. Uh, but in fact, it always matters to whom that writer was saying that. When was that writer saying that? In what circumstances? And how precisely did that writer put it? Uh, and so the kind of textual basis of the kind of knowledge that we have in biography is really important. Another way in which kind of life and writing are mixed up with each other in complicated ways, certainly for literary biography, but I would say for biography generally.
Indeed. This actually brings me to your work on letters.
Mm,
Um, diaries, letters kind of tied in with this idea of literary biography.
hmm
So, um, particularly your research kind of relates to poets' correspondence with other poets.
hmm
And so you've looked closely at the letters of Elizabeth Bishop,
hmm
named Letters, Elizabeth Bishop's Art Form or Something,
hmm
and also Useless Concentration, Life and Work in Elizabeth Bishop's Letters and
hmm
Poems. So, first of all, what inspired you to look at letters in
hmm
particular? And in what ways was this research process different from your work with poems and poetry?
mm, hmm hmm Yeah. Well, was talking a moment ago about the way in which life and work are once maybe sutured together and pulling apart in the case of Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets. Um, there's a way in which the letter as a form, and I think we could say something similar about journals and notebooks and other kinds of semi-private writing or sometimes entirely private writing. These are genres that in some way mediate or constitute a kind of point of connection, of overlap between published work and the life uh, that work comes out of. And uh, so for me, trying to figure out something about the relationship between life and work, I was led very naturally, I think, to an interest in these forms. They are they are kind of amphibious,
Mm,
ambiguous forms. Um, Take the personal letter. It is a form of private communication that nonetheless historically have also been published. So there's often a kind of double consciousness in a writer's intentions and self-awareness between private occasion and the fact that putting this communication down in
mm,
letter form is also a nod to other perhaps future, perhaps public readers.
mm.
And so in that sense, the letter, occupies this kind of ambiguous status. Um, I think letters are quite fascinating to read in and of themselves, but I would say bringing a lot of what we bring to poems to them. They are often, well, Emily Dickinson. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. I mean, she is there casting her poem as a kind of letter, a kind of uh, intimate communication with the reader. Um, and, we can understand the letter as having, in that respect, um, certain kind of overlap with a lyric poem or a confessional poem or, other genres that we might want to explore. Um, Letters are at once a matter of spontaneity of the moment. They are conventionally we understand the letter as being full of mm, kind of access to the letter writer's subjectivity, the way I get to
Mm,
know someone. Um, at the same time, letters are the most conventional of forms. They begin dear. They have
mm.
a date, they're fixed in time, and they have conventions of um, signing off, signing on. I hope this letter finds you well,
Exactly.
etc. Uh, and in that sense, the letters, again, kind of fascinatingly uh, improvisatory and conventional. It's kind of offhand and informal, and it's also often highly literary.
Very true. It's almost like a kind of time capsule in a
Mhm.
way. It's that particular moment and that moment in that relationship as well. So it's at once
Mhm.
that you were saying highly personal, but then if it becomes public, the personal becomes very social, I guess, and
Yes.
it's no
Yeah.
longer that those two people, but it can be in a book of letters sold
Mhm.
in or in a bookstore or something like that. That's
Or
very
sitting in a library for uh, scholars like you or me to pore over.
definitely, definitely. I was going to ask you about the idea of confessional poetry
Hmm.
and which you've just brought up as well, um, and its relationship between letters and
Hmm.
confessional poetry. Can letters be seen as a kind of confessional prose poetry, or even in Dickinson's case, a kind of not even prose poetry, but just poetry. What is the
Mhm.
border, if there is one,
Yeah.
between confessional poetry and a letter or a diary?
Well, putting conventional poetry for a moment to one side as a special
Mm,
case, I would say again that the best letters, uh, a letter by Keats, a letter by Dickinson. Uh, I've edited, as you say, James Merrill's letters, Hart Crane's letters. And by the way, I never intended to do any of that stuff. I just kind of did it. Um, those letters at their best are as rich, complex, resonant, poignant as any poem. Uh,
mm,
and I suppose give us a kind of access to the person that uh, that poems don't, even confessional poems. And to get to that part of the question, I guess I would say that confessional poetry is a kind of fascinating 20th century genre with uh, all kinds of interesting relation to other developments in art forms and culture of the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's a wonderful book by Christopher Grobe called The Art of Confession, which deals with confessional poetry, but also deals with stand-up comedy, feminist performance art, and other developments in this period. What I wanted to say about confessional poetry in this context, and one thing that so differentiates it, I guess, from
mm,
the letter, is that confessional poetry is always, insofar as it is a published form, always has a kind of constructed speaker who, as it were, seems real, but is necessarily mediated by print publication. Reading an intimate letter, that first person is not similarly framed and contextualized. And we have a different kind. Not to say that a letter writer is not canny, coy, and complicated, as indeed the best letter writers are. Uh, but there's a kind of self in a letter, which is just different from a self in a published poem, even if that self in the poem is presenting itself as the poet.
mm, definitely. A letter is, would you say, more honest in a way?
Uh, I don't know if I would want to say honest.
Yeah,
Uh,
maybe that's the one word.
I would say intimate. Um, has a kind of, it offers a kind of access to the writer, again, in the moment, in an important way, that again is just different from the status of the first person, the I, even in the most self-disclosing of confessional poems. Or even
Definitely.
we were talking about Kathy Acker, even in a kind of Kathy Acker autofiction uh, uh, work, that I is different from Kathy Acker in a letter. I
That's
would
very
I would argue.
No, definitely. I suppose that in a work of fiction, even if it's autofiction or literary autobiography, there is still a kind of performance for the public,
Right.
in the uttered I, whereas the I in a letter is the I in a relationship between two people. Maybe that's an
Mhm.
interesting way of looking at it. Like
Mhm.
I in relation to the many versus the I in relation to just one other, maybe.
Yeah, one or sometimes I mean,
Multiple.
letters can have, multiple addressees, of course, and they can circulate in funny ways. They can have multiple writers even, right? Uh, but yeah, I think you're defining that in a helpful way. Yeah, there's a kind of intimate and concrete address in the epistolary, in its private function, at least, that's fundamentally different from the public address of published writing.
Definitely, definitely. I do have one final question for you
Mhm.
today, which is, do you have any advice for young scholars who might be beginning to research the lives of poets,
Mhm.
their letters and diaries, correspondences, or modern poetry in general? Do you have advice for anyone interested in any of these things?
Sure. Um, Come to the Beinecke. I, that's Yale's rare book and manuscript library, and I'm kind of joking. It happens to be the rare book and manuscript library that is, a couple blocks away from where I'm talking to you, and it's an extraordinary archive. But my point is just that there is a kind of, astonishing and largely unprocessed and unsorted archive of 20th century, particularly late 20th century, early 21st century um, poetry in places like the Beinecke and of course many other places, New York Public Library, um, the Emory, the British Library, and beyond that. Are just waiting for people to investigate, which are really, uncharted islands and continents. These libraries have been collecting um, poetry. They've been collecting the whole life archives uh, of poets, as well as other writers, for the past 50, 70 years since the collecting of contemporary literature became a thing, which is itself an interesting subject. And there's just so much to be explored and uncovered there. So I'll send everybody to the library and open a box of letters and see what you find.
That is brilliant advice. Thank you so much. Kind of just getting stuck into it and hitting the ground running and really hearing these poets' voices for yourself. I think
Mhm, mhm.
it's amazing advice. I want to say thank you so much for speaking with me today. I learned a lot. I know everyone listening did as well. So thank you. And I hope you have a brilliant rest of your day. And I hope everyone goes to the archives and gets reading. So, yeah.
Me too. Thanks, Stephanie.